Hi everyone, thank you for joining us in our 2024 complimentary webinar series covering the FAR, or Federal Acquisition Regulations. We are coming to you live today from Washington, D.C., and we're glad you all could make it. Okay, so a bit about this series. As usual, all of our webinars are complimentary and recorded. The FAR has 52 total parts, and we will run through them sequentially each week on Wednesdays and Fridays at noon Eastern Time. The recordings and PowerPoints will be posted within 24 hours of the webinar's ending, and you can find the recordings on our YouTube channel simply by subscribing to it using the link you see on the screen. It's free. You can find the PowerPoint on the SlideShare site using your LinkedIn credentials to log in. Again, there's no cost. We also offer sponsorship opportunities. If you are interested, please send us an email to hello@jenniferschaus.com. Okay, and now for how to sign up for the series. Unfortunately, there's no bulk registration, so you must register individually for each webinar. If you go to the Jennifer Schaus website, navigate to the section called the FAR, and you'll find the individual registration links. Also, the recording links will be posted here upon the completion of each webinar. Please note that we covered the FAR in 2020, so if you are eager to get a jumpstart, please find these historical recordings on our site. Navigate to the Webinars tab and scroll down to the section The FAR 2020. Because it has been 4 years, many of the regulations have changed and been updated, so please use this as a reference tool only. Okay, now a bit about us. We work with established federal contractors worldwide, helping them to navigate the market. Our services range from market analysis reports to contract vehicles and compliance. Some of the contract vehicles we support are listed here on your screen. For more information, please visit our website. Those are our services to federal contractors, but we also provide marketing and advertising services to organizations who are selling to federal contractors. We can add the extra muscle to your marketing efforts via our newsletter ads and webinar sponsorship to in-person events. Please email us and ask for a media kit if you are interested. We are currently offering a discounted offer in our newsletter, which reaches over 33,000 subscribers. If you want to place an order or have any questions, please send us an email to hello@jenniferschaus.com. Contract vehicles can be great marketing tools for pursuing federal business. Current open solicitations include Navy Seaport, Next Generation, and NASA, as well as GSA Align. Additionally, the GSA Multiple Award Schedule is an open and rolling RFP. If you qualify for any of these and need proposal support, please send us an email for a quote. As you know, congressional hearings on both the House of Representatives and on the Senate side are open to the public unless otherwise stated. We have a list here of the upcoming schedule, including the date, time, building, and room numbers. Most meetings take place in the Dirksen, Rayburn, or Cannon buildings. If you are selling to any of these departments or agencies, attending the hearings can be a great way to gather information, understand the process, and also network with influencers. Please join us for these upcoming complimentary webinars with various Apex accelerators. Jennifer will be covering GSA schedules as well as federal marketing for a local Apex accelerator in Virginia. These are complimentary and online webinars, so please join us. She will also be teaching 2 classes for the Maryland Apex Accelerator, one on marketing and one on GSA schedules. These are in July and in December, and once again, complimentary. Now, coming up this Thursday, we will hear from Carrie Palmetier on small business innovation and federal contracting. Specifically, Carrie will cover information on SBIRs and STTRs. These 2 options are a great way for tech companies to grow in the federal sector. This is a 2-part series and, as always, are recorded and complimentary. Our webinars are complimentary thanks to our longtime and generous corporate and in-kind sponsors. Please allow me to introduce them. We would like to thank our friends at GovEvents, the premier platform for posting events relating to government and government contracting. You can find all of our webinars and our events on govevents.com, as well as recordings from our past 600+ webinars. We also want to thank Tom Johnson and his team at Set Aside Alert, the go-to publication for contracting opportunities for small, woman-owned, veteran-owned, HUB-zoned, and 8A firms. Visit setasidealert.com for more information. The Fairfax Economic Development Authority has an online calendar of events and webinars. We want to thank them for posting our events and webinars on their calendar. The Virginia Apex Accelerator at George Mason University offers free one-on-one counseling to established government contracting firms in Virginia on federal, state, and local procurement topics. If you are interested in learning more, please use the links provided to explore their services, review homework recommendations, register for live training, and find useful links to agencies and other self-directed learning. One-on-one counseling is limited to eligible client companies, and appointment requests are handled in the order they were received based on counselor availability due to high demand. Online resources and group trainings are free with no restriction on business location. Join the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce's monthly GovCon Council meeting to network with peers, learn about upcoming events and opportunities, and help to shape future programming. The meetings take place the fourth Tuesday of each month at 8:30 a.m. at the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce. The next meeting will be on July 23rd. Do you want help winning government contracts? Bitsby can help. Users can find contract opportunities from federal, state, and local government. Additionally, you can search for teaming partners, incumbent point of contact, expiring contracts, compliance matrices, and also proposal templates. Create your login today at bitspeed.com. Bitspeed is an official partner of the U.S. Small Business Administration's E2G and Power to Grow program. Events are the ultimate engagement channel to bring government and industry together. 68% of government personnel report that they attend more than one event each year. The Federal Business Council, or FBC, has worked with government and industry for 45 plus years to create gatherings where ideas are shared and to help government achieve its goals. This includes agency industry days, cybersecurity symposiums, technology expos, and offsite meetings. FBC provides full lifecycle meeting planning and event management. With over 5,000 meetings under their belt, FBC has the experience, systems, and personnel to make your next event exceptional. Learn more at www.fbcinc.com. Now, last but not least, please check out our friends over at GovBrew. GovBrew is the most read GovCon newsletter, keeping thousands of GovCon professionals in the loop with news, updates, and opportunities in the federal contracting market, all in a fun and accessible email that only takes 5 minutes to read, and it's 100% free to join. It goes out every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 a.m. It's filled with great content, event postings, webinars, and more. We encourage you to sign up at govbrew.co, or you can use the QR code you see on the screen. Another reason we're here today is to cover FAR Part 44. Okay, let's meet today's speaker. Please welcome Michael Carter to the webinar. Michael, we're so glad to have you with us today, and we're so excited to hear your presentation. I'll put myself on mute and turn the floor over to you. Please let me know when you're ready for your next slide.
Awesome, thank you so much. Happy to be here with you guys to discuss FAR Part 44. A little introduction, I guess, of myself. I am Mike Carter. I'm a director here at Capital Edge Consulting. Capital Edge is the largest consulting firm that focuses specifically on government contract compliance and business systems. The 6 business systems that are currently being recognized, both in FAR and also in the DFARs. I know today we're going to focus on the Federal Acquisition Regulation, call it BASIC, if you will, the FAR itself. My experience comes back from going straight out of college into the government. So I've got just shy of 20 years of direct FAR-based experience, predominantly spending I would say most of my time in this section in FAR 44 and the areas related to subcontracting type of efforts. As a contract administrator, working myself up as an administrative contracting officer for DCAA, and then the last 3-ish years of my government career was working directly for the Contractor Purchasing System Review Team, or the CPSR team, based out of Phoenix. So a lot of time that I've spent in this section and the resulting reviews that occur from it. So I'm excited to share with you guys a little bit about FAR 44 and how to review that, how to interpret it. So looking forward to it. Go ahead and next slide, please. So this is really, FAR Part 44 is really what we're, again, focusing on. It's subcontracting policies and procedures. It talks about quite a few things. If you guys use acquisition.gov, this is a good link to access FAR Part 44. And then we'll dig in here a little bit on what FAR 44 covers, how it's organized, and so forth. So next slide. All right. So why is FAR Part 44 so important? Ultimately, it's the regulatory implementation of public law pertaining to advanced notification and consent to subcontract, which we'll dig into. Obviously, we have to pay attention to regulation that is also supported or supports statute or law. So that's one of the main identifiers of its level of importance. It also establishes something that's probably really important to a lot of us, and this is one of the business systems, is that contractor purchasing system review. We'll dig into that a lot as well. And again, that's something that most of us, or a lot of us, would be really interested in, how those activities occur throughout FAR 44 and what instructions are provided. And then also it prescribes the clause, right, of FAR 52-244-2, which is the subcontracts clause into prime contracts. So this tells the government when that clause is supposed to be included in any of our, in any of industry's contracts that are receiving contracts from the government. Okay. When we look at that FAR 52-244-2 clause, that's what makes the advanced notification and consent to subcontract requirements contractually operative, imposes those requirements. And then also, if we look in that same clause at 52-244-2, paragraph I, that reserves the government's rights to perform that CPSR in accordance with FAR 44. So really important clause when we start looking into what advanced notification and consent is, as well as understanding that CPSR, Contractor Purchasing System Review, requirements and objectives and so forth. We'll be able to see just that level of importance placed on FAR 44 and that clause at 52-244-2. Next slide, please. All right, so how is FAR 44 organized? It starts out as we would expect. I say as we expect. If we look at FAR 44.2, we start talking about the advanced notification and consent to subcontract requirements, what all that entails, what we might need to be able to provide to the government to obtain that consent from them. And then it jumps into that purchasing system review, the contractor purchasing system review in FAR 44.3. Goes through quite a bit of information as far as what the objectives are, which we'll talk about, kind of the scope and so forth. So very good reference for understanding what your contractual obligations, but also the intent of the government when it comes to purchasing system reviews. And then it rounds out and ends again in subcontracting, because FAR 44 is talking about subcontracting policies, procedures for contractors, I should say. It rounds out with subcontracts for commercial items. So we'll talk a little bit about that and what that indicates to us in industry as contractors that support the government. Okay, next slide, please. So we'll dig right into the impacts, if you will, of advanced notification and consent. So when we're looking in FAR 44, there is this opportunity, right, for the government to waive the requirements, if you will, for advanced notification and consent to subcontract when it's performed under FAR Part 12 commercial practice. Okay, that when the government selects or elects to use FAR Part 12 contracting methodology. Okay, it also substitutes consent requirements for contracting officers' written authorization to procure from U.S. sources, from U.S. government sources under FAR Part 15. So we have to recognize that it substitutes that consent requirement. So there's things that we'll talk about as far as just the basic advanced notification and consent. We'll also talk about an alternate one that is an option for the government to use for advanced notification, depending on how your system, your purchasing system is performing. Okay. There's also a designation of specific subcontractors during contract negotiations that we have to be cognizant of. Just because the contract, just because we've included specific subcontractors in our proposal and we've negotiated with the government, and maybe they have included I guess just because we've included them in our proposal, we've negotiated with the government on those subcontractors, that does not in and of itself satisfy the requirements for advanced notification and consent to subcontract. What's interesting about that is there is a section within the clause at 52244-2 that actually requires action from the contracting officer if they are going to count, if you want to say that, if you want to count the contractors that were included in the proposal and part of the negotiations, the contracting officer would actually need to take action and include those subcontractors in the contract under this 52244-2 paragraph J. Okay, so if they are satisfied, if that contracting officer is satisfied as part of the proposal, they can essentially waive that requirement for advanced notification and consent to subcontract by including a list of subcontractors or subcontracts in that subparagraph, if you will, 52244-2J. Okay, and FAR 44202 identifies that capability and requirement for action. Okay, so when we throw that out there, as you guys are negotiating, as your contracts organizations are including these proposals and discussing those proposals with the government, if we are identifying specific suppliers or subcontractors that are going to be included in that contract, this last section here is really a call to action, really, because you need to have your contracts managers or those that are discussing these contracts with the contracting officer to actually ask the contracting officer to take that action and insert those subcontracts into that subparagraph in your contract, right, into FAR 52244-2 paragraph J. There's a text box there that the government would need to complete and either list those suppliers or those subcontractors by name or other identifiable, recognizable nomenclature. If you already have a PO or a subcontract number, they could put it in there as well. So just remember that there is this ability for the government to include those, to let you know you don't need to get consent for these subcontractors because we've already evaluated them. But that action has to actually be taken. We can't just assume, right, based on that third bullet, we can't just assume that because they were included in the proposal that we already have that consent from the contracting officer. Okay. So let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so there are some definitions that we always want to understand when it comes to the regulation FAR. Specifically in FAR Part 44, we get into an approved purchasing system, what the CPSR is, and to me, the last two sections here are super important when we're understanding and reading FAR Part 44. So we'll just start with an approved purchasing system definition, right? So an approved purchasing system is a contractor system, purchasing system that has been reviewed and approved in accordance with FAR Part 44, okay? We'll talk a little bit about the scope here in a little bit, but the review ultimately provides the administrative contracting officer a basis for granting, withholding, or withdrawing approval of the contractor's purchasing system. Okay, so when we look at FAR 44-301, it gives that description of what this purpose is of a CPSR. Okay, so that's what when we talk approved purchasing systems, it's a system that has been reviewed, has been evaluated, and the administrative contracting officer has granted approval, right, of that system. So a CPSR, a contractor's purchasing system review, is a complete evaluation of the contractor's purchasing of material and services, subcontracting and subcontract management for development of the requirement from development of the requirement all the way through completion. So sometimes we might call that from cradle to grave or from inception to completion, if you will, but all the way from the time that you have identified the requirement all the way through performance and closeout, right? All of that is included in that CPSR, what they can look at. Okay. So a subcontract, because we're talking FAR Part 44 talks about subcontracting, right? Our policies and practice, if you will, in subcontracting, we have to understand what that is. So a subcontract is any contract as defined by Part 2.1 entered into by a subcontractor to furnish supplies or services for performance of a prime contract or a subcontract, okay? So this is at any tier that we're talking about this. It includes, but is not limited to, purchase orders, changes, modifications. It really doesn't matter what you call that instrument. If it is a contract, right, that is requiring a subcontractor to furnish supplies or services, and ultimately you're going to reciprocate with some form of payment or consideration, that's typically what we're talking about as a subcontract, okay? And since that definition of subcontract utilizes the term subcontractor, we have to understand what a subcontractor is in the context of FAR 44. Okay, so subcontractor is any supplier, distributor, vendor, or firm that supplies, that furnishes supplies or services to or for a prime contractor or another subcontractor. So again, at any tier, doesn't matter if it's the prime, if it's the government, or a lower tier subcontractor, if that entity, I want to call it, is providing or furnishing supplies or services, they are a subcontractor. It doesn't matter what you call them, whether you call them a supplier, distributor, vendor, friend, right? Any firm that furnishes those supplies or services would be considered a subcontractor in the context of FAR 44. Understanding that there are other sections of the FAR that may have a separate definition or different usage of the term subcontractor. For FAR Part 44 and purchasing system compliance, a subcontractor is any of those, okay? All right, next slide, please. So what qualifies as consent to subcontract? So we'll dig into advanced notification and consent to subcontract as far as the requirements, when it's applicable, when it's required. But what is considered consent? And it is pretty limited. It is the contracting officer's written consent for a contractor to enter into a particular subcontract. Okay, so you're getting consent from the government, whether that's the PCO or procurement contracting officer or the administrative contracting officer. Really depends on who owns the delegation, which we'll talk a little bit about as well. Has to in writing consent for you to award that subcontract. Okay. And we can get into what it means, right, for in writing, because I think that is important. A lot of the times when we think about in writings, you know, some of us might think about pen and ink, like it has to be handwritten type signature, or something that's kind of that old school paper type process. And that's not necessarily the case. The FAR does define it. And so in writing, or written is really any worded or numbered expression that can be read, reproduced, and later communicated, and includes an electronically transmitted or stored information. So technically we could get, it could be in the form of an email, it could be in the form of a letter, it could be in the form of other worded or numbered expression, right, that is understood by the parties, if you will, as consent. But it does have to be retained and be able to be reproduced or provided for evidence. So ultimately we can't take verbal consent, right, because that's not going to be considered in writing. And it does have to come from that contracting officer that has the authority to grant such consent, okay? So keep those things in mind. Next slide, please. All right, so when is consent to subcontract required? And there are two different scenarios that we're going to be dealing with here. One is if you have had a contractor purchasing system review and you have an approved purchasing system versus you don't yet. Okay, so in this scenario on this slide here, we're going to be talking about whether or not a scenario where you do have an approved purchasing system. Okay, so ultimately FAR 44202-1A governs, when this is applicable. But if we look at the clause itself, 52244-2D, talks about what happens if you have an approved purchasing system. Okay, and so ultimately in paragraph D of that clause, if we look at 52244-2D, there is also text box, if you will, for the for the government to provide instruction to the prime contractor. And so if they impose consent requirements, then that contracting officer has determined that an individual consent action is required to protect the U.S. government adequately before the subcontract type, complexity, or value is going to be awarded. So they can identify requirements for you guys to obtain consent based on different situations. Okay, they might say any cost type or any flexibly priced or anything over a certain dollar value, you need to get consent. But typically, if you have an approved purchasing system, you wouldn't have to obtain consent to subcontract unless there is instruction specifically identified at 52244-2D. Okay. Typically, the government would do that on subcontracts for critical systems or subsystems or specific components or services that are critical to performance of their contract. Okay, or your contract in this case. So subcontracts can be identified again by a specific subcontract number if you already have that. It can be by class of items. It can be by specific subcontractors even. Okay, the ability for the government to insert instruction there is pretty limitless. Go ahead and next slide. So you'll see that when we talk about our approved purchasing systems, very limited. When we look at a consent to subcontract requirements where you do not have an approved purchasing system, whether you have not been assessed or you've been disapproved, then the governing section is FAR 52202-1B, and then in the clause itself, it's 52244-2B and C. Okay, if we look at the differences between them, FAR 44202-1 is a bit more descriptive, but not necessarily inconsistent. It's not inconsistent with the 52244-2 clause. So we're going to break this down here in a second. So we want to go to the next slide, just remembering now we're talking about if you do not have an approved purchasing system. Okay, so if you do not have an approved purchasing system, and your prime contract contains 52244-2, then consent is required if, and we're going to see some bold text here because ands and ors and stuff like that is very important when we're looking at requirements. Okay, so if the prime contract is cost reimbursable T&M, right, time and materials, labor hour, or a letter contract, an undefinitized contract action, and also, so any of those, consent is going to be required, and also for unpriced actions under a fixed price prime contract that exceeds the simplified acquisition threshold, right? And currently the simplified acquisition threshold is $250,000. Okay, so all of those are scenarios where consent to subcontract is required, but then there's this and subcontract. The subcontract is cost reimbursable T&M or labor hour. Okay, so there's no threshold specified there. Or if the subcontract is fixed price that exceeds one or the other of the next two bullets. So if it's for DoD, if your subcontract is in support of DoD, Coast Guard, or NASA, then that fixed price subcontract would have to be the greater of the simplified acquisition threshold, or 5% of the total estimated cost of the contract. Okay. Or if that subcontract is in support of a civilian agency other than Coast Guard or NASA, then it's either, if the purchase the subcontract is going to exceed either the simplified acquisition threshold or 5% of the total estimated cost. So the big difference here is it's not the greater of the two, it's if it exceeds either of those two thresholds. Okay. So you can see there's a lot more indication, a lot more requirement on, or possible requirements on a contractor that does not have an approved purchasing system yet. Okay. So next slide, please. All right. So we talked about the consent to subcontract, when it's applicable, who's responsible for consenting. So typically it's the ACO, or the Administrative Contracting Officer, unless the procuring contracting officer has retained that contract administrative responsibility or specifically withholds that consent responsibility from the ACO delegation. Okay, so some contracting officers retain that, some contracting officers will delegate that down to administrative contracting officers. Okay, so we just have to understand, who's responsible for that. Typically, if you send a consent to a request for consent to subcontract to the administrative contracting officer, if they have not been delegated that responsibility, they would let you know that you need to reach out to the PCO, or vice versa. Okay, but it is one of those two individuals typically that is responsible for consenting to subcontract. Next slide. All right, so what do we have to include in a request for consent to subcontract package? This is really interesting because we don't often see question marks in the regulation. Most of the time they are statements or their instruction, whether that's to a contractor or to the government. But this is a scenario where in FAR 44, it actually asks a bunch of questions, and it asks these questions of the contracting officer, but that's saying, hey, do we know the answers to this, or these are questions that need to be considered before granting consent to subcontract. So what does that mean? Realistically, what that indicates is that we are supposed to provide sufficient information so that the contracting officer can actually answer these questions, right, and grant you this consent, because that's the goal. Okay, so we can go through these questions. There's quite a few. Is the decision to subcontract consistent with the contractor's approved make or buy program, if any, right? So we have to understand first, not everybody requires a make or buy program, but if there is one, is this consistent? Okay. Is the subcontract for special test equipment or other equipment or real property that are available from government sources? So should you as a contracting contractor be utilizing government sources? Is the selection of the particular supplies, equipment, or services technically justified? They're supposed to evaluate whether or not you actually need to buy this service or this equipment in order to satisfy the requirement. Okay. Has the contractor complied with the prime contract requirements regarding small business subcontracting and then use of nonprofit agencies by the Committee of Purchasing from people who are blind or severely disabled? To me, this is actually a really cool program. I've seen it in action. I've worked with the contractors, or the contractors that actually supply those services or the products that are produced by those individuals. And I don't really need to talk about it, but those are really kind of cool programs. So they're supposed to understand whether or not those programs are applicable and whether or not you guys are complying with those, right? So whether or not you're utilizing small businesses as expected. Maybe you have a small business subcontracting plan. Are you guys abiding by that plan as well? And then we're all supposed to obviously utilize small businesses as much as possible. So if we wanted to look, I know we're not covering it, but FAR Part 19 does discuss that in further detail. Next slide, please. All right, kind of continuing on this questioning scenario, what was adequate price competition obtained or its absence properly justified? Okay, so we can talk a little bit about that adequate price competition, right? Did we compete? And I think if we did, that's great. Was it adequate? They'll assess that. But also, if we couldn't compete, did we justify? Do we have a non-competitive justification in our file? A lot of those in industry will call that a single or sole source justification or non-competitive justification. Was that adequately justified as far as why we did not compete? Okay, so part of that package is likely that explanation required of that justification being documented. Okay, did the contractor adequately assess and dispose of subcontractors' alternate proposals if offered? Okay, if we even allow for alternate proposals. Did the contractor or does the contractor have sound basis for selecting and determining responsibility of a particular subcontractor? Did we make a determination that that supplier was going to be able to perform, right, this activity that we need them to execute? Have you or has the contractor performed adequate cost or price analysis or price comparisons and obtained certified cost or pricing data and data other than certified cost or pricing data when applicable, when required here, okay? So ultimately, no matter what, there's some expectation, right? There's a requirement to do price cost analysis and determine prices to be fair and reasonable. But also, if certified cost or pricing data was required, did we get that? Did we assess it? And then do we get that certificate, if you will, of that data to make it certified? Is the proposed subcontract type appropriate for the risks involved and consistent with current policy? So, you know, are we doing a firm fixed price subcontract? If so, is that appropriate, right? Are we doing a cost type contract? And if so, is that appropriate? If it's very well defined, the need is defined, a lot of the times the government would say, hey, that should be fixed price, right? If it's very defined and the risk is manageable, okay? So that's what they're looking for here. So you'd need to tell them, right, in your request for consent, hey, this is what I'm doing and why, okay? Has adequate consideration been obtained for any proposed subcontract that will involve use of government provided equipment and real property? Okay, so if you are providing government property or equipment, you know, what kind of consideration has been discussed and agreed to? Was that consistent or adequate with what the expectation is from the government for that? So they're going to look at that. Kind of fun questions so far, right? If you want to go to the next slide. All right. So still sounds weird. They're still asking a bunch of questions that we have to answer in our request for consent. Okay. You know, has the contractor adequately and reasonably translated prime contract technical requirements into the subcontract requirements? This is interesting because, you know, the concept of, hey, we don't flow down the entire scope. We don't flow down everything that's in the prime contract down to our subs, right? Because they're, in theory, they're only performing a portion of that contract. So have we translated that into actual subcontract requirements, statements of work, and so forth, okay? Does the prime contractor comply with cost accounting standards for awarding the subcontract? Okay, getting into CAS now. And is the proposed subcontractor listed as an excluded party in the System for Award Management, or SAM? Okay, so this is something that will be part of a debarment requirement, which is covered in FAR Part 9, but they look for it here, right, in your consent to subcontract package. So did I go validate that they're not included in SAM? And did I evidence it to the contracting officer in my request for consent to subcontract that I had done that due diligence and that they are not that they are not listed? And then if they are listed in SAM as an excluded party, have I provided the contracting officer rationale for why that is necessary? Okay, because that's the next thing that they're gonna have to ask kind of themselves, but also you. Okay. All right, so those are the questions that the government is required to, or that the contracting officer is required to answer before granting you consent to subcontract. All right, so next slide. All right, so are some consent packages inherently riskier? And the answer is absolutely, right? Depending on what kind of contract we're talking about. So we have to be particularly careful, and the contracting officer has to be particularly careful when any of the following applies. Okay, so if a prime contractor's purchasing system or performance is inadequate, they're going to pay more attention. Okay, maybe we're doing vendor rating and so forth. Closely working relationships or ownership affiliations between the prime contractor and sub may preclude that free competition or result in higher prices. So they're going to be paying attention to those scenarios. Okay, subcontracts proposed for award on a non-competitive basis at prices that may be unreasonable or appear to be unreasonable, or at higher prices than those that the government's paid before. Okay, under certain circumstances or similar circumstances. And then obviously any subcontracts that are proposed on a cost reimbursable T&M or labor hour basis, all of those inherently create additional risks to the government, and therefore they're going to pay a little bit more attention to them. All right, next slide. Okay, so this is an interesting concept because consent to subcontract is them reviewing and consenting for you to subcontract. It does not constitute a determination of acceptability of the subcontract terms or price. This is not them agreeing that the price is fair and reasonable, okay, or of the allowability of costs. So we have to understand the context. So typically it does not include that unless the approval specifies otherwise. Okay, and then the contracting officer has some limitations. They're not to consent to the following: cost reimbursable subcontracts that exceed the fee structure for fee limitations at FAR 154044 C4I, subcontracts providing for payment on a cost plus percentage of cost basis. Those are prohibited under FAR. Subcontracts obligating the contracting officer to deal directly with the subcontractor. We shouldn't be expecting that or requiring that, right? They may do it sometimes, which they sometimes shouldn't, but it's an obligation. They're not going to accept that. Subcontractors that might result in arbitration, judicial determination, or voluntary settlement between the prime contractor and its subcontractor to be binding on the government. So these are things in terms and conditions that you have to pay attention to. And then repetitive or unduly protracted use of cost reimbursable T&M or labor hour subcontracts. Okay, so we have to pay attention to FAR 16 also when we're talking about FAR 44 requirements and purchasing system scenarios, okay, and consent to subcontract packaging. All right, next slide. All right, so there is a difference but a connection between advance notification and consent to subcontract. So far, all we've been talking about is consent to subcontract. So advance notification is required to typically occur before consent to subcontract is granted, provided that one of the requirements applies for when advance notification is applicable. Okay, so ultimately under FAR 44, FAR 52244-2, anytime consent is required, notification, advance notification is also required. The only time that those are not connected to each other is under FAR 52244-2 Alt 1, where advanced notification could be required even when consent is not. And similarly, FAR 52244-4, which is really architectural and engineering services scenario. So if we look at FAR 44-2012, advanced notification, right, under any cost reimbursable contract, the contractor is required by statute to notify the contracting officers as follows. Okay, unless the contractor maintains an approved purchasing system, right? We said that. Unless paragraph D says something, you don't have to get consent, and therefore, since consent's not required under that scenario, advanced notification is not required. So unless the contractor has an approved purchasing system, the contractor would have to notify the contracting officer for DoD, Coast Guard, or NASA before award of any cost reimbursable subcontract or any fixed price subcontract that exceeds the greater of the SAT or 5% of the total estimated cost. Okay. The second one is even if the contracting officer or even if the contractor has an approved purchasing system, and then you would still have, before award of a cost plus fixed fee subcontract, any fixed price subcontract that exceeds either SAT or 5% if it's a civilian agency other than Coast Guard or NASA. Ultimately, that's when this alternate one comes into play. So contractually, those requirements are imposed through that alternate one of 52244-2. And any other scenario, advanced notification is required if consent is required. Okay. So there is that connectivity. They don't necessarily contradict each other, but we do have to understand that there are some scenarios where advanced notification is required even when consent is not, or even when we have an approved purchasing system. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. So kind of just a follow through, right, when it comes to what creates this requirement. Contracting officers are supposed to include 52244-2 when they expect the consent, advanced notification consent is necessary. They can include the 52244-2 Alt 1, and then obviously for the architectural and engineering services, they would include that 52244-4, which is including only consent when making a substitution for subcontractors, associates, or consultants that were previously identified and agreed upon during negotiations. So a subset of that for the architect and engineering services. Next slide, please. Okay, so purchasing system review objective. This is the CPSR portion of FAR 44. And it's really, the objective is to evaluate the efficiency and effectiveness with which you spend U.S. government funds and comply with U.S. government policy when subcontracting, which obviously is addressed here in FAR 44. That review provides, again, the basis, the ACO, a basis for granting, withholding, or withdrawing approval of the purchasing system. So that's the real intent or objective, is to review that, to give them that basis for granting and reviewing. All right, next slide. All right, so the ACO is required, this is their responsibilities to determine the need for a CPSR, okay, based on, but not limited to, past performance of the contractor, the volume, complexity, and dollar value of subcontracts, okay? So they have to make that determination. They generally will ask some questions to make that determination, maybe send a general questionnaire out, if you will, for the contractors where they're trying to make these determinations. And so if a contractor sales to the government, excluding competitively awarded fixed price, awarded fixed price, competitively awarded fixed price with economic price adjustments, contracts, and sales for commercial items pursuant to FAR Part 12, if the contractor sales to the government, excluding those, are expected to exceed $25 million during the next 12 months, then they're supposed to determine whether or not a CPSR is needed. Okay. Those sales include those represented by prime contracts, subcontracts under government prime contracts, and modifications. So whether you are a prime contractor or not, that's the expectation here. All right, next slide. So generally, a CPSR is not performed for a specific contract. It's a review of your system. Okay, so the next concept here is this $25 million. That is a soft, I'm going to call it a soft threshold, because the agency can determine whether or not they want to raise or lower that $25 million. If we looked at the Department of Defense, they've actually increased that to $50 million. So that agency can make that determination of what that threshold is. But also the ACO that's just a guidance post, if you will. They could perform a review even if you have not reached that threshold. Okay. The kind of fun part is once you've had an initial determination that a CPSR is needed, and you've had a CPSR performed, then typically every 3 years that ACO is to determine yet again whether or not a CPSR is needed. So usually you'll have that CPSR approximately every 3 to 5 years, but let's go with 3 as the regulation identifies. So, okay. And then if necessary, that cognizant contracting officer will conduct a purchasing system review, whether that's that individual themselves or a team that has been assigned to do that. All right, next slide, please. All right, so the extent of the review is that they're going to evaluate the purchasing system. So unless segregation of subcontract is impracticable, then the evaluation is not supposed to include subcontracts awarded by the contractor that are exclusively in support of U.S. government contracts, that are competitively awarded fixed price, competitively awarded fixed price with economic price adjustment, or awarded for commercial items pursuant to Part 12 commercial. So if the prime contract is any of these, then we don't need to include our subcontracts in support of those. Okay. So considerations listed in 44202-2 for consent evaluation also need to be used in the evaluation of a CPSR purchasing system. Okay, so they're going to be looking through that list of items to pay special attention to. Okay, specifically, they're going to identify some market research. They're going to do price competition, certification or certified cost or pricing data, responsibility determinations, debarment, intercompany transactions, CAS, and subcontracting, and so forth. Okay, pretty good list of things that they're supposed to evaluate. Next slide, please. All right, and then also, in addition to a CPSR, that ACO is supposed to maintain sufficient levels of surveillance to ensure that you are effectively managing the purchasing system. So even between CPSRs, the ACO is supposed to maintain surveillance. Okay, so usually it's every year or so, sometimes more often. They should have that plan established for how that's going to occur. They should that plan should also provide for reviewing the effectiveness of contractors' corrective actions taken as a result of previous government findings or recommendations. And then this is kind of key, that duplicative reviews of the same areas by CPSR and other surveillance monitors should be avoided. So they should be talking, there's some things that are interconnected between estimating and CPSR purchasing systems. They shouldn't all of those parties shouldn't be reviewing the same content. Okay. All right, next slide. Okay, so the ACO, once a review occurs, they are to withhold or withdraw approval when there are major weaknesses or when the contractor is unable to provide sufficient information upon which to make the affirmative determination. So if there are weaknesses in the system, they actually have a requirement, major weaknesses, some would consider it systemic. They are required to withhold approval or disapprove the system. Also, once it's approved, the ACO can withdraw that approval at any time. So there's also a scenario of recurring non-compliances. Some consider those repeat findings, that those can lead to withdrawal or disapproval of a purchasing system as the CPSRs continue to happen. When approval is withheld, the contracting officer of the ACO has to quickly, promptly request you guys to furnish a plan for corrective actions within 15 days. If that plan is accepted, then they're supposed to schedule a follow-up review to make sure that everything has been implemented effectively and it's preventing future occurrences. And then they're supposed to schedule that as soon as possible after after the contractor identifies that the corrective actions have been taken. Okay, so they try to be efficient there. Next slide. All right, so upon request, an ACO may inform a contractor that a purchasing system has been, of a proposed subcontractor has been approved or disapproved. So your customer, if you're not the prime, could ask the government if your system has been approved or disapproved, and they may inform that contractor of that. If the proposed subcontractor has not been reviewed, the contractor shall also be advised of that. So they'll give the status of your system. Next slide. All right. So the ACOs share CPSR reports and notifications. This is interesting, depending on the agency on how they accomplish this, but there are minimum requirements for who is supposed to be informed if your system is either withhold, disapproved, or approved. That has to be at least the cognizant contract audit officer and also the contracting activities prescribed by the cognizant agency. So if you get a disapproval or an approval, pretty much everybody that you care about in the government is going to find out. Kind of maybe a positive thing or a negative thing if that approval is withheld. All right, and I think next slide we're going to start talking about the commercial items, subcontracts for commercial items. If we want to go to the next slide. As contractors, we are at all tiers to the maximum extent practicable. We are required to incorporate commercial items in as components of our delivered items to the government. Okay, there's a long-lasting history on trying to get that accomplished. Ultimately, at any tier, even if it's divisions, subsidiaries, affiliates, subcontractors, suppliers, we're supposed to try to use commercial, except those required to implement provisions or laws. So when it comes to clauses, we have very minimal requirements for clauses, except for those that are required to implement law or executive orders and or determined to be consistent with customary commercial practices for the item being acquired. And then 52244-6 implements those policies, as well as the identification of lists of clauses that are supposed to or should be applicable at the subcontracts level for commercial items. We're not going to go through that list of clauses. There's a decent list, but only those identified in 52244-6 are required to be flowed down to your subcontractors. All right, so next slide, please. All right, and so kind of to wrap that up as far as FAR 44 goes, we identify this as the FAR. We have to understand also that there's a large contingency of the defense industry. If DCMA, or the Defense Contract Management Agency, has cognizance over your purchasing system, or if the DCMA CPSR group will otherwise review your purchasing system, they will typically measure based on information identified at DFARS 252.244.7001, which is a Contractor Purchasing System Administration Clause. They have a little bit more spelled out criteria. There's 24 criteria for an acceptable purchasing system. So just wanted to point that out as we've got the FAR 44 requirements for advanced notification consent, CPSR basic, if you will, and commerciality, but also if DOD is involved or DCMA is cognizant, they're typically going to look at that 24 criteria in the 7001 clause of DFARS. So the other piece of importance here is that DCMA, the CPSR group at DCMA, is the only team of people within the federal government whose sole job is to perform these CPSRs. So even if you don't have cognizance, or if DCMA doesn't have cognizance, other agencies often will employ DCMA or that DCMA CPSR group to exercise or to perform these reviews. So just a kind of a heads up to all of us. All right, next slide. I think this is kind of the end, which is awesome. If you guys have any questions, you have my email there as far as questions or concerns. I'm happy to get with you. But I will turn the time back over to Emma.
Thanks again, Michael, for such a great presentation, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. As mentioned, you can always catch the recording on our YouTube channel within 24 hours, and you'll find over 600 webinars on government contracting there. That's it for today's webinar. Thank you again, Michael, and thank you everyone for coming to join us. We hope to see you this Friday.
Thank you.